That is that we try to understand how the climate crisis impacts global poverty and what we can and should do in order to tackle both the climate crisis and global poverty. And so in this context, we are grateful to host today 5 inspiring speakers who are going to share with us what they do in order to tackle the climate crisis. And so without further ado, let's turn to the first speaker, Julia Olson. Julia, the stage is yours, please.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And I want to thank Thomas in particular for inviting us to speak today, and for all the conference organizers for putting this together. It's such an important topic, and all the topics that the Build Back Better conference is covering this year. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everybody see that? The slide, great. So I am here, I'm Julia Olson, I'm the Executive Director and Chief Legal Counsel of our Children's Trust. And with me today, who will speak at the latter part of our presentation, is Matt Dos Santos, who is our Managing Attorney and also has connections to Brazil, which they will tell you about. I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about our Children's Trust and our background. We began this work 10 years ago. And at the time that I founded our Children's Trust, climate change was not thought of as a human rights issue. I think a lot of the human rights organizations around the world hadn't really connected this crisis around our climate system as being one that was about the fundamental rights of people and children. And when we founded the organization, we knew that children needed legal representation on this issue. Young people are really the innocent ones in this crisis that we face. They are born into the crisis and they will endure it, and they will clean up long after the adults living today are gone. And of course, the disenfranchised youth who come from communities that are disproportionately harmed by climate change, including Indigenous communities and communities of color, those frontline communities and the children among them are really the ones who will bear the brunt of this crisis. And so if you think back to 2010, it was a time when youth were activated. So I knew many youth and organizations that were marching in the streets. They understood that this crisis was going to impact their lives and their futures, their abilities to have families. I met many young people who were trying to speak to politicians and going to meetings and raising their voices in all the ways they knew how. And they were still, I think, largely invisible and not being heard by those in power. And it's important for adults to remember that most children, a huge, population on this planet, can't vote and don't have political rights. And so we founded the organization to really give young people a voice in this crisis and allow them to be able to go to the branch of government where they have to be heard, and that's the courts. Let's see. Sorry, my little shifter is not working here. There we go. So at our Children's Trust, we have 3 main principles. The first is that we, as the only law firm representing young people, it is our single mission to really elevate the voice of youth and future generations for climate rights. In doing that, we only advocate for science-based and legally enforceable systemic remedies in court. And we use basic human rights, those unalienable fundamental rights that we all hold to bring our cases to the courts. And so the case that really illustrates this approach in law to dealing with the climate crisis is our landmark case, Juliana versus the United States. It's the one that's gotten the most media attention. And while this case is against the government that is the biggest polluter in the world and the one most responsible for the cumulative emissions that have caused the climate crisis, the United States, we have also brought cases on behalf of youth in cases or other types of legal actions in all 50 states across the United States. And we've been helping young people around the world to also sue their governments. But I will share with you first the story of Juliana. So like all of our cases, this is not just a case about the climate crisis. It is at its core a children's case. And what the 21 young plaintiffs in the Juliana litigation are arguing is that they have rights to life, rights to liberty and personal security. They have rights to equal protection under the law, to not be treated as less than the adults who have come before them and live today. They're also arguing that there are natural resources that are so essential to human life that they are protected by a doctrine called the public trust doctrine. And those resources include our air, our waters, our oceans, and our shorelines, and essentially our climate system. And that governments around the world, including the United States, has an obligation to protect those resources in trust for these young people, but also for future generations. So this case was filed in 2015 against the Obama administration, and it has had many, many twists and turns and a lot of complicated legal procedures that I won't go into. But I'm going to highlight some of the key moments in the case and bring you up to speed to where we are today. So in 2016, the trial judge in the case issued one of the first really important rulings, which said that the youth could go to trial. They could bring their case against the government and be heard in court. And importantly, she wrote that she had no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. And that was a really important declaration of the law in the United States. It was the first time that a court had said that the US Constitution, in protecting people's right to life and liberty, that implicitly includes the right to a climate system that is not being essentially destroyed by our government. So after that decision, we were preparing to go to trial. We went up to the Supreme Court twice and beat the Trump administration, which had become defendants in the case. And we were about a week away from trial when the courts decided that they should hear the case on what's called an interlocutory appeal or an early appeal before the evidence has really been fully presented. And so the three key questions that our intermediary court, our Court of Appeal, was considering were, can children and youth even go to court? Do they have access to justice, to have their constitutional claims heard against their government? And that's a question of standing. And then the second question was, does the court have a duty to hear the case? Can the court do anything in light of the evidence that the youth are being harmed by their government? And then the third sort of big picture question about the different roles of the different branches of government is a question about the separation of powers. And the Trump administration had argued that the political branches can do whatever they want around climate change and energy policy, and there's nothing the court can do to check that exercise of power. And the way I think of that question is, does the political majority who are in power get to make decisions to destroy the climate system and continue to perpetuate the crisis? And do those decisions get to go unchecked? And the clear answer in our minds is, when you have a constitutional democracy, they don't get to go unchecked, because it's the duty of the courts to really provide that check and protect our rights when the other branches do things that undermine and deprive us of our rights. So we argued this case in the summer of 2019 before the Court of Appeals. And in January of this year, we received a decision that was a 2-to-1 decision against us. The majority, so a 3-judge panel, and the majority in the Juliana panel on appeal made all kinds of really important, tremendous findings in our favor. In fact, when you read the opinion, it looks like the plaintiffs are winning. So I'll just point out a few of those here. So first, the court said that there was this substantial evidentiary record documenting that the federal government has long promoted fossil fuel use, despite knowing that it can cause catastrophic climate change, and that the failure to change that existing policy, which is essentially the energy policy of the United States, that it would hasten an environmental apocalypse. The majority found that the United States is expanding oil and gas extraction 4 times faster than any other nation. And the dissenting judge, who would have ruled in our favor, agreed with the majority and said this was an existential threat that was actively backed by the government. And those determinations of the court were based on the evidence that was before the court at the time of this appeal, even though there hadn't been a full trial to evaluate the evidence. And, one thing that is really important about our work is, particularly when we are suing governments like the United States, the perpetrators of this crisis, we're looking at not government's failure to act on climate change. We're really looking at the question of, what have governments done to actually perpetuate and contribute to this crisis? And this chart, I think, is really illustrative. It shows, going back to President Truman and President Eisenhower, some of the earliest presidents in the United States who were beginning to understand about the climate crisis issue. We have evidence going back over 50 years that the United States government was well aware that if we continued burning fossil fuels, that we would have a resulting climate crisis. And you can see that across history, every president continued to increase the risks and add to those carbon emissions that are causing climate change. And what people don't always understand is that even under President Obama, and then of course under President Trump, the US really became the top oil and gas producer in the world. And yes, our coal production decreased slightly, but we more than made up for that decline in our increase in gas production. And so now the question, and we've put a little picture of President-elect Joe Biden on the right-hand corner, because the question is, will he change that legacy and do something different, or will he be another in a line of presidents that takes the same approach? So all of that government conduct has had real consequences. And the court made some other really important determinations based on the evidence, including saying that extreme heat that is melting the polar ice caps could cause sea levels to rise 15 to 30 feet by 2100. The court looked really closely at, looked really closely at the youth's injuries that were being caused by the conduct of the government and the resulting climate crisis. And some of the core types of injuries in the case that we've brought forward are the medical conditions that are being exacerbated. So several of the youth have asthma. They have increased allergies from the elevated levels of pollen. They've had damage to their property, including floods from hurricanes and sea level rise. And then also psychological harm, which is afflicting a lot of young people. The court said, these are profound rulings and statements in the majority opinion that you don't see in ordinary case law. And this was one of, I think, the most powerful, that the problem is approaching the point of no return. Absent some action, the destabilizing climate will bury cities, spawn life-threatening natural disasters, and jeopardize critical food and water supplies. So I put in these pictures of the fires that the west coast of the United States experienced this year. I know that there are other countries around the world that are also very familiar with fires, including Brazil and Australia, and the increased incidence of drought, and then these catastrophic fires that are only getting worse. This is one of our plaintiffs, Alex, on his farm in Southern Oregon. And this was a picture from this summer in September when fires, I'm sure as many of you know, the fires raged, and our air was some of the most dangerous, unhealthy air in the world for a period of weeks. And, one thing that is, I think, just a real profound change in the part of the world we live in is back in the 1970s when I was born, the wildfire season in the Northwest was about 20 days. And now it's over 120 days. And so the season just keeps lengthening and lengthening. And of course, the fires are getting worse and worse. And so all of this is part of the body of evidence that we have brought forward in the Juliana litigation. And from there, looking at the impacts of climate crisis, we then look at, well, what is the solution? What is the remedy in these cases? And so I want to talk a bit about that principle that our Children's Trust has, which is about using the best available science in our cases and really seeking those science-based remedies. So there's abundant science now that really started from Dr. James Hansen's transformative work in the 1980s and 90s, where he was beginning to look at the question of, what is the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that really begins to shift how our system responds? And when do we get outside of the energy balance that has created this really livable, blissful planetary system that has allowed humans to thrive and develop? And what the evidence shows, both in terms of protecting the climate system itself and in protecting our ocean life, and particularly the coral reefs, is that when atmospheric carbon dioxide exceeded 350 parts per million, that's really when the system started getting out of whack. And all of the experts that we're really lucky to work with tell us that at a minimum, we really need to aim to get back to that level of 350 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide by the end of the century. And then in the next century, we may even need to go below that. And so all of our work is really tiered to that critical number. And for those who don't know, 350 parts per million corresponds to about a 1 degree Celsius rise in warming, whereas numbers like 450 parts per million correspond with a 2 degrees Celsius rise in warming. And so just to summarize the science piece, because it's really core to our work, when we're advocating for legal standards to protect the climate for young people, we are seeking standards that are science-based. And so again, we're arguing for 350, not 400 or 450. We believe, based on just real world observations of what's happening with the climate system today and its impacts already, that the 1 degree Celsius of warming that we've already endured is too much, and that we shouldn't allow the law to sanction a rise in the Earth's temperature of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that the law shouldn't do that. You know, we may miss the mark, but we shouldn't sanction those numbers in law. And then again, after 2100, the numbers may shift and we may know more and have to revisit what is actually safe for humanity. The good news about all of this is we also work with experts on the solution side, the energy transition side. And what's been remarkable in the past 5 years of litigating the Juliana litigation is that the costs of decarbonizing our energy systems just continues to go down. And so this graphic is a graph that shows what decarbonization would cost for the state of Florida in the United States. I don't have the specific graphic for the United States as a whole, but the analysis is virtually the same. And so if you look at the period from 1990 to 2020, the cost of energy as a percentage of gross domestic product really fluctuates. And, you know, some of the peaks that you see in the historical part of the graph reflect things like significant changes in prices of oil, or, you know, wars and conflict that cause those prices to go up significantly. And what you see on the right side of this graphic is that when you decarbonize, when you move away from fossil fuels as our energy supply source, whether you do that through 100% renewable energy, you do it through different uses of biomass. The experts who have done this analysis, they ran many different scenarios to show that it's possible to transition off of fossil fuels using a lot of different forms of energy. And no matter how you do it, you basically get low costs compared to historic costs. And the other thing you get is you get this leveling off of the fluctuations that we've seen historically in energy costs. And so I think this is a really important part of the story that often goes misreported. There's a lot of confusion about what it will cost to transition away from fossil fuels. And the reality is that we already spend trillions of dollars on energy, you know, and the percentage of money we spend on energy as a component of our gross domestic product, not just in the US, but everywhere, is a lot. We spend a lot of money, but right now we're investing it in sources of energy that are really destroying the planet. And so we need to shift those investments to obviously clean energy. And it's really good news that for consumers, the costs are going to be on the lower end of what they've been historically, and they're going to be steady. So that's the practical side of the remedy. Tying that back into, well, what can be done through litigation brought by youth? This is, again, specific to the US case, the Juliana litigation. But what courts can do they can do three really big things. First, they can declare the fundamental constitutional rights or the human rights of children. And they can set those standards for climate protection so that all government conduct has to adhere to those constitutional standards. And, it's like the analog in the US court system that we often talk about and that we've gained a lot of inspiration from is the civil rights litigation. So thinking about Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, when the US Supreme Court said it was no longer constitutional to have segregated public schools, that segregation violated the right to liberty and equal protection of the law that young people had. And that declaration of law, well, it hasn't been perfectly implemented in the United States. It was really an important moment to declare that that could no longer happen and that governments could no longer sanction that. The second thing courts can do is they can order remedial plans. So one of the things I've seen in this work over the last 10 years that's really been lacking are those comprehensive plans that governments need to put together in order to integrate systems like transportation and electricity. So what we see happening in a lot of different places are laws that are requiring 100% renewable energy, for example. But those laws often are only pertaining to the electricity sector, and they're not pertaining to transportation. And when you think about a post-fossil world, what we're really talking about is an electrified world, a world where we electrify transportation, we electrify industrial processes. We're no longer burning fossils in order to create energy. And in order to do that effectively, you need plans that integrate all of these systems in different energy sectors. So a court can order a plan that the government would then prepare and implement. The third thing that courts can do is courts can stop the conduct that they are engaged in that is worsening the climate crisis. And these are called injunctions. So government can put an end, courts can put an end to government expanding fossil fuel extraction. Courts can end deforestation. Courts can end the infrastructure that's necessary for ongoing fossil fuel development. All those things that governments approve can also be stopped by the court. And then finally, the other thing that can happen in litigation is there can be settlement agreements. So right now we're in an interesting time where the Trump administration will hopefully soon be leaving Washington, D.C., and we'll have a new president and a new administration. And one of the things that President Biden could do is actually come to the settlement table and talk about what can be done in order to resolve the plaintiff's claims against the United States government. And we're hopeful that we will see some movement in that direction. But meanwhile, just to tie up the Juliana litigation, we, in March, after receiving the adverse decision, that 2-to-1 decision from the Court of Appeals, we filed what's called a petition for en banc rehearing. And all that is we're asking a larger number of judges, it would be 11 judges who sit on the Court of Appeals, to rehear the youth's case and correct the errors that we believe were made by the Ninth Circuit in saying that the youth have been harmed, the government has caused it, but the court can't do anything. And that's the piece that we're hoping that a full panel of the Ninth Circuit will fix. So our Children's Trust, as I said, we have cases at the state level in the United States. I've listed some of those here. There's a lot of text, don't worry about it, but we have cases in different stages of proceeding in the United States, and we're growing those cases as well to target other states on behalf of youth. And we are working globally. And before I turn it over to Matt, I just wanted to highlight a couple of cases. So this case is La Rose versus Her Majesty the Queen. It's a case brought by, I think it's 16 youth, Canadian youth, including Indigenous Canadian youth, against the federal government of Canada. And it really mirrors the same types of claims that are brought in the Juliana litigation. So this case is right now headed up to the Court of Appeals after an adverse decision by a lower court judge. So we'll be seeing that proceed in the Canadian Court of Appeals likely in this winter or early spring. And the question there is again, do the courts have a role to play in reviewing the conduct of the other branches of the Canadian government and reviewing the laws that are perpetuating the deep fossil fuel extraction industry that is happening in Canada? Meanwhile, there's two other youth-led climate litigation efforts in Canada. And just yesterday, one of them got a really beautiful positive ruling from another lower court judge. That case is challenging the conduct of one province in Canada, but we're excited that that case is going to be moving forward. And then I just wanted to mention this because it's been happening over the past week. So in the early part of our work at our Children's Trust, we worked with a lawyer in Norway who went back to Norway after being at a conference with us and drafted an amendment to the Norwegian Constitution. And that Article 112 basically codified in the Norwegian Constitution this right to public trust resources, the right to have an environment that would sustain life and that would protect future generations. And based on that constitutional amendment, Greenpeace and a youth organization called Nature and Youth filed suit against the government for its Arctic oil development. And that case has worked its way through the courts. And just this past week, the Norwegian Supreme Court, the full court, I think it was a panel of 16 or 17 justices, spent 7 days hearing argument in this case and hearing evidence about whether it's constitutional for Norway to continue to develop the oil and gas resources in the Arctic. So really big case, really important. And we look forward to seeing how that court rules, hopefully in favor of the youth. This is just a map to show how widespread youth climate litigation has become in the last 10 years since we started this. And remember, at the time, back in the early 2000s, climate litigation was not being brought as a rights-based type of litigation. So human rights just really weren't a component of it. And now you can see in all of these cases, and these are just youth-led cases. These don't include all of the cases on behalf of other NGOs or other adult citizens or seniors who have brought climate litigation in the last decade. This is just young people rising up, and it's really inspiring and exciting to see. So I'm going to end there and turn it over to Matt. And thank you.
Bom dia e boa tarde. Meu nome é Matt dos Santos. Eu sou advogado senior de OCT, Our Children's Trust, e estou muito grato pela oportunidade de falar com você sobre o trabalho global da OCT e as oportunidades que vamos para desenvolver caso constitucional no Brasil em nome da juventude brasileira. Eu vou apresentar em inglês, mas queria dizer olá primeiro em português. So today I'd like to discuss at a high level some of the exciting litigation that's happening around the world, including Brazil, and the possibilities that we see for the development of youth rights to a healthy environment grounded in constitutional law of the jurisdiction and the most accurate and current science available. You know, Julia already discussed some of the principles that we have for partnering with organizations around the world, but our essential principles are that they be youth-led organizations and focus on the environment, and that they adhere to the best science available. So the 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide and a reduction of warming to below 1 degree. Julia mentioned quickly the constitutional case in Canada, and I want to share a little bit about our work with our partners, Defensa Ambiental do Noroeste, or DAN. This is our case in Mexico. The launch of this new case marks an important milestone for our children's trust and for youth-led climate actions, because now there are youth-led climate lawsuits that span all of North America. That case is on behalf of 15 Mexican youth from the state of Baja California, and they have filed a climate lawsuit against their federal government. The suit is called Jóvenes v Gobierno de México. Those plaintiffs, who are between the ages of 17 and 23, ask the Mexican government to comply with its constitutional obligations and the terms of the general law on climate change, and issue regulations and public policies to properly enact that law. In recent years, climate change has reached an emergency level in Mexico, putting food, health, and access to water at risks for millions of citizens. And today, Mexico is one of the 10 countries that are collectively responsible for 73% of all greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. The main sources of emissions in the country are the generation of energy from the use of fossil fuels, much like Julia discussed in the United States, but also inappropriate techniques used in waste management and the agricultural and industrial activities in the country. Given the urgency of this crisis and the harmful impacts from climate change that they have experienced, the youth plaintiffs believe the Mexican government has an obligation to guarantee that its people have access to a healthy environment as established by their constitution. And while a general law on climate change was passed in 2012, there are still no regulations or no public policies that allow for its proper implementation. And you might ask, how can that be, right? Almost a decade later. And we learned recently why that is. So our hearing was scheduled for earlier this year, and it was delayed because of the COVID-19 crisis, as many cases were at the beginning of the year. But recently, a new concern emerged, and we learned that the court was unable to serve notice of the hearing on the agencies responsible for implementing the law on the climate change passed in 2012. As it turns out, many of these agencies appear to exist in name only, if at all. So you have to ask yourself, how can the government be protecting the environment in earnest when the very agencies supposedly set up to protect these important resources don't even exist? I suspect that we'll see more news from Mexico this year, or later this year, or very early in 2021, as we sort out how to serve notice on these agencies that have no physical address and don't even exist.
Excuse me.
No problem.
I have to be mindful of the time, just to let you know of that. Okay, that's all.
Okay, thanks. And I'll just quickly talk about the Brazilian litigation, which is in some ways similar, right? There are 3 significant cases in Brazil challenging the country's use and failure to use the climate fund, Brazil's climate fund. This fund was formed by the country and other countries' funding. These cases focus on money available to deal with various impacts to the environment, including climate change and deforestation. On Wednesday of this week, so just 2 days ago, through Greenpeace, another case through Greenpeace, a coalition of non-governmental organizations brought the Brazilian government to the federal Supreme Court for its active negligence to protect the Amazon and the people of Brazil. This case is seeking an immediate reduction of deforestation in 2021. The plaintiffs in that case are asking for an 80% reduction in deforestation this next year. And that case is very similar to 2 other cases already filed in Brazil, all trying to ensure that money in Brazil's Green Climate Fund or the Amazon Fund are used to address climate change and protect the remaining forests from deforestation. One of the things that we think is most exciting about Brazil is that Brazil's constitution is one of the most expansive in the world in how it articulates protections of human rights, including the rights of children and indigenous people. Its protections, we believe, are poised for the kind of litigation we at Our Children's Trust support globally, of protecting young people's rights to a safe climate. For example, Article 225 is the right to an ecologically balanced environment. It's the government's obligation to protect Brazil's environment for present and future generations. And we're very excited about the potential for working in Brazil because the courts, despite some of the changes to the presidency in Brazil, the courts have often expressed their independence. And over the past 10 years, we've overwhelmingly seen that people are dedicated to climate action and justice. And youth and indigenous communities are rising up in Brazil. So we have been exploring Brazil and pathways to establish stronger constitutional protections for youth around climate change, including conversations with regional groups like AIDA and other Brazilian organizations and attorneys to evaluate the pathways for youth NGOs to advocate for their climate rights in Brazil. And I know we're running short on time and I want to give folks opportunities to ask questions. So I will just close by saying, thank you so much for inviting us to be here. And if you'd like to know more about our litigation and how you could participate in our litigation, please reach out to us at our email, which I think will be available. But just in case I'm going to say it, it's info@ourchildrenstrust.com or .org, sorry.
Thank you very much, Julia and Matt, for this inspiring work that you and your colleagues and youth leaders are doing around the world. Now let's have a section of a conversation between all of us who are here. And I would like to invite you all to take advantage of the fact that we do have people who translate between Portuguese to English. And so if you feel comfortable, you can either use the chat or open up your mic and say what you have to say with your own voice. If you want to say something with your mic, please open it and I'll call you in the order in which I see the mics being opened. I saw already 2 questions, so I would like to invite those who wrote the questions to say it out loud with your voice. And if you don't feel comfortable, I'll read your questions. Okay, so I see in the chat a question, but I cannot see anymore who wrote it. So I'm sorry about that. And it's for you, Julia. Congratulations on the excellent work and exhibition. I have a question. How can climate change be transformed into positive investment and innovation opportunities with green transformation in mind?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I tried to type an answer, and I don't know if it's going through, but I'll just reiterate that here. So in the 2020s, you know, this decade, the types of investments that are really needed are to begin large-scale electrification processes in both the transportation sector and then in buildings. We need to ramp up construction of renewable energy generation and upgrade transmission capacity. So transmission lines need to be upgraded in order to accommodate more load in the systems. And so there's a lot of sort of basic infrastructure upgrades and investments that are needed. And then the piloting of new technologies. There are great companies, and even the US government's NASA program is looking at electric airplanes, for example. And so really investing in electrification is what's key right now. And I think there are a lot of job opportunities and job training that can come with that as we move some of the workforce out of the fossil energy sectors and more towards the renewable energy sectors. That's what really needs to happen in the 2020s. And again, in terms of how that happens, those investments can come from the private sector. They can also come from the public sector and from government investment. And the important thing to remember is that this isn't money that's just, it isn't like this becomes taxpayer money that's just given away, right? These are investments and there's a return on these investments. And so we're hoping that we will begin to see that happening in the United States and elsewhere, you know, even more over the course of this decade.
Thank you, Julia. And there's another question, but again, now I can't see who wrote it. So if those of you want to speak up, you are most welcome to open up your mic. But if you don't feel comfortable, that's fine as well. I'll just wait for a second, and if nobody opens the mic, I'll read the question.
Yeah, I mean, there was one other question about protected areas and how protected areas, I think, can be used to address this problem and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And there are lawyers around the world who are looking at bringing litigation to protect World Heritage Sites, for example. We've been talking to lawyers both in Australia and Ecuador about really important World Heritage Sites like the Great Barrier Reef or the Galapagos, for example. And I think what's important in these cases, from my perspective, is litigation that is aimed at protecting those areas for the benefit of the areas in and of themselves or the species. That's really important litigation. It also doesn't always resonate with everybody or tell the full story. And so I think connecting the loss of those special places, whether it's a World Heritage Site or otherwise, connecting it to the human element. Why do we care about those places? Why do we want our children and our children's children to be able to experience those places and benefit from the biodiversity and the food sources and the recreation and the spiritual importance of these places for generations to come? So yes, it's really important. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I think it's important to tie to the human element as well.
Thank you. I just received a message from the support that people cannot open up their mics. And then Thomas wanted to try something. Well, Thomas, can you try to open up your mic?
Yeah, I can try. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I have a question about possible downsides of litigation. So at one extreme, there is the view that you just bring a legal case and see what happens, right? The worst that can happen is you lose your case, and then somebody else can bring some other case, and you get a little publicity out of it, maybe, but if you lose, it doesn't matter so much. Another view would be to say, well, actually, a poorly conceived legal case can set back the cause, because you might then have precision in the law where previously there wasn't. You create a precedent that can be a roadblock for other cases that are being brought. Now, I'm not sure whether you can answer, where do you see reality being here for all countries? It may vary from legal system to legal system, but if you could at least say something about the United States in this regard, that I think would be very helpful. How dangerous is it? Is there any danger? And how good do you really have to be in order to make headway with a legal case?
So I'll start with that answer, and then I'd love Matt to jump in with their perspective, coming from the American Civil Liberties Union and doing a lot of work where sometimes you lose before you win, just to share that perspective. But it's my view that any cases being brought on this, existential question need to be really well formed, and it's up to attorneys to bring the best possible cases to the courts. And that means having the evidence that will support your claims, having solid expert testimony, ensuring that the plaintiffs who are bringing these cases to the court can demonstrate actual harm that they are experiencing and will experience in the future. So bringing real controversies, real cases, not just symbolic cases. And so we, at our Children's Trust, we work really hard to do that. We do work with top experts around the world. We have an evidentiary record in the Juliana litigation that is tens of thousands of pages. We did deep historical research into the government's practices and conduct. For the past 50 years, we went to every presidential library to do extensive research so that we could really bring the full story to the court. And I think it is incumbent on attorneys to only bring the best cases forward, and to also, fully understand the law that you're working with, and how to build the best case. That said, if we aren't using an entire branch of government to help us solve this crisis, we are not doing our job, right? There's a reason we have 3 branches of government. And when the political branches of government have been failing us and violating our children's rights for this long, it is time for the courts to step up. And sometimes it takes a while for the courts to step up and do the right thing and act as that constitutional check on other branches. But it is vital that they do so and that they get in this game, because we need everybody. We need civil society. We need all branches of government. We need scientists. We need communicators. We need everybody in on this, because this is the crisis of our lifetime. So one branch of government does not get an out. And these are valid cases. These are not symbolic cases. These are real cases that deserve hearing and decisions. And this isn't new. So Matt, if you want to jump in and just talk about how the law evolves over time, I think that would be helpful to answer that question.
Yeah, absolutely, Julia. And thanks, Thomas, for the question. I think what Julia said is right. This isn't new, right? This idea that that courts, when can courts act? When should courts act? And whether these decisions, right, the decisions of the rights of people, individuals, should be left to a majoritarian political process. And if history is any lesson, I think that there should be a careful distinction between, as lawyers and folks looking at these cases, see wins and losses, like thinking about the distinction between whether the case was meritorious and should have won, and whether it did in fact win, right? And I say that because I think that so prior to joining as the managing attorney at our Children's Trust, I was the legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union, known in the United States as the ACLU, which is the largest nonprofit law firm working on civil rights and human rights in the United States. In fact, the ACLU appears in the United States Supreme Court more often than any other law firm in the country, except for the United States Department of Justice that represents, the United States in every action. And there I was very deeply involved in immigrant rights cases, LGBT cases, especially cases on behalf of transgender youth, and also cases on behalf of same-sex couples seeking the right to marriage before the Obergefell decision in the United States. And we had this debate. I mean, I remember, this in, about 2008, having heard from people saying, going to the Supreme Court is the wrong idea. If you do this, you could potentially set back LGBT rights for 20 years if we get a bad ruling. And the idea was, of course, right, like that there could be potential long-lasting consequences. But what I think we have seen time and time again is that there are a series of cases, and you can look at almost any civil rights case in the United States. There are a series of cases where plaintiffs with essentially the same harms and essentially the same injuries ask the court for redress and are denied, until that first case where they're granted their remedy. And at that case, you have a monumental shift in the way that the law thinks about these harms. However, it should be very clear that the people in those cases who did not win before had the same harm. And it was taking the law and the judges to catch up to where society and those people knew they were being harmed in order for their rights to be vindicated. And I think that if we were to sit passively by and not use the judiciary as a tool, we would not see our rights being vindicated, because we would not be pushing the law forward as it needs to be pushed in order for it to catch up to a society that desperately needs it to act right now.
And for two analogies there, so there's two sort of metaphors we've used in talking about this. One came from Professor Mary Wood, who has done amazing work to further the public trust doctrine in the context of climate crisis. And she used to hunt with her dad, and she would say that when you're out hunting ducks, you have to shoot ahead of the duck, and the duck will eventually catch up. But if you shoot at the duck, you'll miss. Other football fans, American football fans on our team, say it's like the quarterback throwing to the wide receiver. You don't throw at the wide receiver, you throw ahead of the wide receiver so the receiver can catch the ball when they catch up to it, right? And so the work we are doing right now, this cutting edge climate litigation work, it's shooting ahead. We are waiting for that moment when the courts will catch up and issue these landmark decisions. And we are seeing it in other countries like the Netherlands, like Colombia. It is happening, but it will never happen if the cases are not brought to the courts.
Julia and Matt, unfortunately, I'm mindful of the time, and we can continue this fascinating conversation for hours ahead as you stretch the legal system and civil society to new norms. So could we stretch the time if we just had it? And I'll conclude with your permission by saying that as an educator working with educators, with teachers and high school students, we share with them your work. work that you and your colleagues and leader teach the youth are doing. And it really and deeply inspires them and empowers them to see that civil society works in all kinds of walks of life and fronts, and everybody are doing the best that they can, and we all push for the same goal. So thank you very much for your part in this session. And with your permission, we will move forward to the next speaker, Jaap Spier from the University of Amsterdam.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Jaap Spier from the University of Amsterdam. The stage is yours, please. Oh, not from the University of Amsterdam. I'm sorry.
No.
Oh, that's what my notes show. I'm sorry. Please say it right. But the stage is
Cambridge and Stellenbosch. Thank you very much indeed. Also, many thanks to Thomas for the invitation. Well, as the two previous speakers already mentioned, it's really high noon. We are facing catastrophe if we are unwilling to change course radically and at very great pace. In an ideal world, politicians should do the job. They should simply agree on appropriate legal instruments containing sufficient obligations to avoid catastrophe. That's not happening. Just by way of illustration, a very recent leaders' pledge for nature. The leaders, I quote, commit not simply to words, but to meaningful action and mutual accountability to address the planetary emergency. Well, we know what will happen, nothing. But at least they have changed the wording and they are now talking not only words, but more likely than not, that's what we'll get. Hence, we can't avoid to think about other strategies that might work. And a focus on the obligations of corporations seems really important. They can influence the entire chain from suppliers to the ultimate products and services. Electricity companies can reduce the emissions caused by the combustion of fossil fuels. And together, they would, for practical purposes, also reduce the emissions of people. And if it would be possible to concretize the legal obligations of enterprises, and if we could bring enterprises to believe that they should comply with those obligations, we would not need politicians. They would still be welcome if they would be willing to do a proper job, but we could do without them. But that presupposes that it is possible to discern the legal obligations of enterprises. And first, a few words, why is that important? Well, if enterprises don't have a clue about their obligations, they can't comply. Others can't assess whether enterprises comply if they don't have a clue what the obligations are. Meaningful disclosure is simply impossible if an enterprise does not have a clue about its legal obligations. Non-compliance may give rise to liability. Liability is in the air, as is mentioned by central banks and many others. But liability doesn't solve any problem. What we need is prevention. We must avoid that global warming passes fatal thresholds. An international group of experts from around the globe, initiated by Thomas and myself, has first tried to discern the legal obligations of states, the Oslo Principles. And secondly, we embarked on discerning the legal obligations of enterprises, the principles on climate obligations of enterprises. For the members of our group, their bios, the many distinguished endorsers, I refer to our group's website, www.capesinmackpesquisa.org. Climate Principles for Enterprises.org. The Oslo Principles were launched in 2015, the Enterprises Principles early 2018. Since, only 3 years back, but still, since a lot happened. Alarming IPCC reports, new research by other climate experts, and further depletion of the already limited carbon budget. Our expert group believes that the current version of the Enterprises Principles do not longer suffice. And we have been working on an update, which will be published within a few days. And I will mainly focus on that update. It contains 49 principles, accompanied by an extensive commentary over 300 pages, in which we try to explain what we have meant. The commentary also provides a legal underpinning, i.e., human rights law, environmental law, liability law, company law, all kinds of declarations, codes of governance, pledges, authoritative reports, academic writings, case law, of course. Part of it is soft law, we know that. But courts are increasingly willing to apply also soft law sources. If we do not only focus on the law as it stands, we believe that it is very important also to look at the law as we believe it will develop. Why? Well, for the time being, if you ignore our principles, the law is mainly unsettled. At some stage in the future, judges will tell us what the law happens to be. And for practical purposes, they will think at the time of delivering their judgments, well, what do I think that the law is? And for practical purposes, they always apply that to the old cases. And that means that it is really important to try to figure out, to the extent we can, how the law is likely going to develop. Critics may argue, they probably will argue, well, but you can't interpret non-existing law. There's nothing else than policy or issuing moral judgments. I think that that view confuses uncharted territory and a lawless realm of the law. The administration of justice does not come to a standstill at the boundaries of uncharted territory. Since time immemorial, judges have tried to keep pace with the demands of society, and they are changing. As the European Court of Human Rights nicely puts it, the law is a living instrument. And yes, of course, that means that you also take into account moral views. Of course, it means that you also ask the question, what would be a desirable outcome? I know that from my 19 years in the Supreme Court. That is, at least in part, how you shape the law. There's nothing new. That happens all the time. So don't make the mistake that if there is no black letter law, there is no law. That's simply not true. And if you're talking about, well, but shaping the law according to your moral values or to what you perceive to be a desirable outcome, that's what conservative judges also do. But the outcome is different. What they deliver are conservative judgments, but the idea is not any different. Well, we had to make choices, of course. And we have tried to pair ambition and realism. It would have been possible to map more demanding, more stringent obligations. And of course, we have also considered that. But we believe that that would not have been a brilliant idea. At the end of the day, each initiative aims to have an impact. Time for idle talk has elapsed. We need action, not tomorrow, but right now. And that means that we need to get the ears of those at the wheel. And if you map overly ambitious, overly activist principles, they will be ignored altogether. Perhaps not by NGOs, but we also really need the ears of the corporate world, of investors, and also of courts. In his autobiography, Gordon Brown wrote a very kind preface to our update. And in his autobiography, he wrote a very kind preface to our update. And in his autobiography, he discusses the only way a progressive party can succeed, I quote, by being both radical and credible. It can be credible without being radical without being credible, but it will never be a successful party of power. It can also be credible without being radical, but it will no longer be progressive. In neither condition, it will achieve anything truly worthwhile. And that was also really our problem. How far could we reasonably go? A few examples. Should we opt for a threshold of 1.5 degrees C or well below 2, although nobody knows what that means, or somewhere in between? Well, we have opted after lengthy discussions for 1.75 C. Why? Because we believe that that is still within reach. And very recently, a distinguished member of the IPCC told me, you are, for practical purposes, right. 1.5 is really out of reach, at least in short term. When we have reached the stage that there are no longer greenhouse gas emissions, we may start thinking about negative emissions. And we may be able to go back to 1 or perhaps even less than 1 C. That's possible, but that's not going to happen in the short term. And what we need, really need, is a discussion about what needs to be done in the coming decades. And even more importantly, we need a discussion about what has to be done as from tomorrow. And setting the bar at 1.5 would mean what we are going to submit will be ignored. 1.75 is already quite ambitious. Another difficult issue is the 2050 paradigm. For a reason I really fail to understand, most people seem to believe that we still have until 2050. I'm not a climate change expert, I'm a lawyer, but based on what I have read, and that's really a hell of a lot, I'm absolutely convinced that we do not have until 2050. And that's also the position we take. Although we don't mention a specific year, well, we are not experts, we can't do that. There are many reasons why we believe that we should be very cautious to say, well, we still have 30 years. Whether we really have 30 years depends on, well, are we going to pass tipping points? To what extent are global emissions to be curbed? And if we are realistic, we know that won't be enough. What is going to happen with non-anthropogenic emissions? What will be the new insights of climate science? And that means that in our view, and that's also what we are submitting, is that we have to assess every 5 years how many years we still have to deplete the carbon budget. Well, if that would be until 2050, would be fantastic, but we don't believe it. Of course, we believe that the precautionary principle is extremely important. It's one of the cornerstones of environmental law, and it plays a very valuable role in the context of impact assessments. It plays a very important role if you have to ask the question, well, is there still room for the exploitation of new oil fields or gas fields, the Norwegian case? But if you would apply lock, stock and barrel, the precautionary principle, to the climate change scenario we have to opt for, and if you translate that into legal obligations, the obligations would be so extremely stringent that there is not the slightest chance that they will get the ears of anybody. And now I realize that what I'm going to say will not be appreciated by many, but I'm still making the point. We don't deny at all that we do have obligations towards future generations. The trouble with that discussion, and this is the very greater part of the discussion, is it's utterly abstract. And it is so easy to say, yes, we do have those obligations. Yes, fair enough, that's true. But what does it mean? And there is barely anything about it. We couldn't find any concrete guidance about what that really means when we have to shape the legal obligations of the corporate world. And if we look at the interests of the present generation, and part of the generation will still be alive by the end of this century, in 80 years, well, then we believe that there is a sound basis for stringent obligations. Well, in an ideal world, but we don't live in such a world, even more stringent obligations would be fantastic, but it simply won't work. So let me really try to achieve what is possible. The law is the way to an end. It's not a beauty contest. And of course, we have taken into account, and we very much agree with the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. And of course, many very poor countries will be disproportionately hit by climate change. And they did not cause it. So it's only fair that those countries and enterprises in those countries have, comparatively speaking, mild obligations, and in specific areas, no obligations at all. And then a bird's eye view of our 49 principles. And apologies, but I simply can't discuss 49 principles, many very detailed, and 300 pages of the commentary in the remaining 20 minutes or so. First, reduction obligations. In our approach, enterprises, at least as a rule of thumb, have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at the same rate as the countries in which they operate. And the idea behind that approach is, if enterprises curb their emissions at a different rate, the country will never ever be able to comply with its obligations. Of course, we offer some flexibility for a country to reallocate the reduction burden among enterprises. But as a rule, it seems to be a sensible approach to say, well, if country X has to reduce its emissions in a specific year by Y%, then the same goes for each single enterprise in that specific country. How then to calculate the reduction obligations of states? Well, first, you have to look at the remaining carbon budget. You have to assume that that has to be depleted along the lines of a glide path. We believe that each citizen is entitled to the same amount of emissions, a per capita approach. Well, if you put all that together, you can relatively easily figure out how much a specific country has to reduce its emissions. And for developed countries, unlikely scenario that they have issued more ambitious NDCs, nationally determined contributions, well, then the country has, of course, to comply with its more ambitious NDC, and the same goes for enterprises. And here lies the trick, but well, that is the Paris Agreement, and who are we to say that that is mistaken? Also, developing countries have pledged to issue NDCs. Well, if they are doing that, you have to assume that they are willing to comply with those NDCs. And in our reasoning, that means that the same should go for enterprises active in those countries. That's not what we are saying, that's what they have saying themselves at the occasion of the Paris Agreement. In addition, enterprises have to take measures that can be achieved without incurring relevant additional costs. For example, if it is possible to switch from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy without relevant additional cost, of course you have to do that. You have to switch off lamps, heating, if an office is not in use. If measures can be taken that incur costs, they have to be taken if the costs pay back. And that may go, in many instances, for example, for installing solar panels. Products and services is really very important. It's important because if you reduce the emissions of products and services, that means that the people at large will consume less energy. And that really matters. We have discussed at quite some length what would be a proper yardstick. Well, we believe that excessive emissions have to be avoided. And of course, then the question arises, what does excessive mean? Well, as a rule of thumb, emissions are excessive if they are much higher than those of competitors. If the cost of countervailing measures to offset excessive emissions can be if the cost can be offset by increasing the price of the products and services, well, then it's utterly reasonable to say, well, that is what an enterprise has to do. If the profits generated by products or services easily allow for taking measures to reduce the emissions of products and services, well, of course, you have to take those measures. Suppliers is also important, and there we perhaps slightly overstate our case. What we are saying, in essence, is in selecting this is not the virus, this is just a slight cold. I'm terribly sorry. We are saying that in selecting a supplier, you have to ascertain and take into account whether the supplier complies with our principles. Of course, we realize our principles are not law, so there is no legal obligation for enterprises to comply with our principles. What we mean to say is this. Of course, an enterprise may challenge what we are saying. We may be mistaken, we openly admit that. But then at least they have to explain what they believe are their obligations instead. And that answer can't be, well, we don't think that we have any obligation. That's simply almost certainly not true. And it rather speaks for itself that the selection of a supplier that provides energy from coal-fired power plants or other excessively emitting fossil fuels requires a compelling justification, which for practical purposes means will almost never be possible to explain. In our view, advertising excessively emitting products or services requires a compelling justification. That goes, for example, for products based on deforestation. There's a lot of discussion about the question whether the fossil fuel companies are the one and only problem. And there is an increasing view that the answer is yes, they are the one and only problem. That view has some merit, but we believe that this is by no means self-explanatory. Worse, it's probably even counterproductive. Why? Well, look at where most of those companies are based. Can you really imagine that it stands a fair chance to win a case against big oil in many countries around the globe? I won't mention names, but you can imagine which names I mean. So if it would be true that they are the problem and they have to be sued, and otherwise, well, nothing can be done, then progress is almost impossible. We believe that it is much more important, much more attractive seen from the angle of results to focus on all enterprises and what we have introduced in the update, buyers of fossil fuels. Governance is an increasingly important topic. And when you talk about that topic with experts in the field of company law, that's not my field of expertise, but if you talk with those people, really the top people in that field, and if you ask them, do you believe that directors are under an obligation to discern the legal obligations of their enterprises, you don't get an answer. And that's strange. That's unsatisfactory. It seemingly, at least in their view, is not obvious that directors of enterprises have to figure out what the legal obligations of their enterprises are. If they don't do that, they can't take the right measures. And, well, to our group, it is really self-explanatory that there is such an obligation. And it matters. Apart from that, of course, they have to assess on an ongoing basis the short, medium, and long-term impact of climate change on the enterprise. They have to assess the climate change related accounting assumptions and reporting procedures. For the time being, that is barely happening. They should stop lobbying measures irreconcilable with keeping climate change below fatal thresholds, be it 1.5, 1.75, or well below 2. At least that lobbying should come to an end right now. There's a lot about disclosure, and we of course we have principles about disclosure, but they don't add much to the important TCFD report to which we extensively refer. Environmental impact assessments are tremendously important, and if there is one realm of the law where courts already right now are quite courageous, it is impact assessments. But we, of course, we mention the topic, and we very much agree that it is extremely important. But we don't add much new to the discussion, so for the purpose of this presentation, I skip the issue. Investors is difficult. Investors is difficult not because it is unclear that they can play an important role. It is crystal clear they can. And happily, one of the very few positive developments of the past years, they are increasingly active, but not yet active enough. They can put pressure on enterprises to do significantly more than they are currently doing. They can refrain from buying stocks or bonds from enterprises that do a bad job. But they also face a problem. And the problem is that there's so much money that needs to be invested. And there are so few enterprises and states that do a good job. If they would only be allowed to invest in those entities, the very few enterprises, the very few states that comply with their obligations, almost irrespective of how you define them, well, there would not be enough investment opportunities, and worse, that would mean that all the other assets would be bought at bottom prices by hedge funds. Well, you can imagine what would happen then. They don't have any incentive to put pressure on those enterprises to do a better job. So all in all, for now, and I very, very much hope that that will happen, change soon. For now, the better strategy is to say, well, let they put as much pressure on enterprises to do a much better job. Let they refrain from buying the worst in class. Perhaps they should focus on the best in class. But saying, well, you are not allowed to buy enterprises and states that do a poor job, won't work. But it does work if you tell them, but if you invest in enterprises or in states that don't comply with their obligations, then you have to promote as fiercely as you can that they should upscale their measures. Then we have achieved already quite a lot. And that is happening more and more, although much more can and needs to be done. And there is some low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is accountants, credit rating agents, insurers, and attorneys. They are in a position to stem the tide. And they do a terribly poor job. Terribly poor. All of them have, in one way or another, to figure out what the obligations of enterprises are. Insurers to assess the liability risk. Auditors to be able to audit properly. If you don't know the obligations of an enterprise, you can't assess liability risk, you can't assess whether it does a good job, you can't assess the potential reputational risk. So you really need to know all that. Rumor has that lawyers ever more get questions along the lines, can you please tell us what our obligations are? And, well, there's not much reason to believe that all those entities really have a clue about the obligations of enterprises. And there's even much reason to believe that they don't want to know it. And that's the reason why we are saying, well, but these entities can't escape discerning these questions. They really should figure that out. Otherwise, they may face liability themselves. Well, but that doesn't solve any problem. So we should put utmost pressure on them to do a much better job than they currently do. And again, I'm not saying, well, they should apply our principles. Of course, we would be very happy if they would. But our principles are not law. They are our interpretation of the law. We know that. But a lot would be won if they would at least start genuinely thinking about what are our clients, enterprises we have to rate, we have to do the accounting. What are their obligations? They may arrive at a very different solution as we have arrived to. Fair enough. But at least they must start thinking about it. And if they would start doing that, that would probably have a major impact. Well, enterprises keen to harp on the tune, how come? Of course we don't have obligations. Our contribution to climate change is absolutely minimal. So, seen from a legal angle, we don't have any obligation at all. Well, seen from a doctrinal angle, that stance is no nonsense, sadly. Still, there are ever more people saying that the minimal position defense should be swept from the table. That's also our view. And what lawyers and enterprises harping on this tune do not realize is that the law is not, at least not only, about legal doctrine. It's also about morale. It is about the question, can we really justify that because we are harping on a doctrinal feature, catastrophe has to set in? Can we really justify that? And many judges will no doubt answer that question in the negative, as they have already done at quite a few occasions. What has happened with our principles? Well, very few words. Authoritative.
Just with your permission, I have to tell you to be mindful of the time. We have about 4 minutes.
Yes. I think I still have 3 minutes.
Yeah, sure. 3-4 minutes for sure. Thank you very much.
I will do with less. Promise. First, authoritative reports, such as David Boyd's brilliant Safe Climate, refers to our principles. Our website is visited daily by people from around the globe, really from all countries. And some international law firms explicitly refer to our principles, but many more should do that. Not necessarily to agree, but at least to say, well, that might be what the law is about. The choice between hugely insufficient measures or compliance with legal obligations like our principles is not between the devil or the deep blue sea. For now, compliance is possible, it's affordable, as the recent report illustrates. The alternative is the devil and the deep blue sea. And it's really astounding how many people seem to believe that that is an attractive option. Thank you very much. It was, I think, 1.5 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. You do still have some time. You don't have to rush that much.
It's okay. It's okay.
It's okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Jaap. Thank you very much. Just a technical comment. We're very sorry for the interruption that we saw on the chat. Thank you very much, Felipe, and the support for making sure that that stopped. Please, those of you who attend the meeting and want to address Jaap with any question or comment, you are most welcome. I think Joachim, you want to say something, am I right?
Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Jaap, for this quite inspiring talk. I actually have 4 questions, so I keep them short, if I may. The one is the way you calculated sort of the budgets each country has in sort of an equal per capita share, and in that you left out historic emissions, and that's something like me working for a development organization usually hear from partners in developing countries that industrialized countries with historic emissions should have smaller budgets. So I was wondering which rationale you had behind that to leave out historic emissions. A second question regarding the obligations of companies. I remember the talk I heard from a car producer a couple of years ago, a long time ago, a car producer that tried to produce a 3-liter car, and it didn't work well, and they had to fire a lot of employees after that because they left a lot of money. And they kind of argued that they have several obligations. One might be climate protection, but another may be to maintain jobs. And I wonder how companies should navigate along trade-offs between the various obligations that they have, how you address that. And maybe I only raised 3 questions. The last one would be how you see the obligations of companies to be political actors. I mean, I work in advocacy, and oftentimes in climate policy, advocates from companies advocate for less stringent climate policies, at least if they emit a lot. So I think a major obligation of them would be to help shaping ambitious climate policy also. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Yes, we have not incorporated historical emissions for several reasons. The most important reason is pragmatism. In our assessment, what we are proposing is really on the brink of what stands a chance of getting the ears of those at the wheel. Secondly, well, we could have incorporated historical emissions, but how far do you go back in the past? That's not really obvious. And to some extent, but I realize only to some extent, an enterprise or a state that currently emits a lot also emitted a lot in the past. So the fact that it now emits a lot already means you have to curb your emissions at a significant pace and to a very significant extent within a very short period. Is that fully convincing? No, it is not. But pragmatism is rarely fully convincing. I realize it is to some extent a one-liner, but I'm afraid it's no less true. Second question is perhaps even more difficult. Climate obligations and jobs. Well, over the years, at least as from the start of the Industrial Revolution, it happened all the time that, well, for different reasons, there was no longer room for specific products or services. Well, that may indeed imply that a factory that is unable to curb its emissions to the extent needed has to close its doors. Well, that has happened more often, and there are enough alternative jobs available if enterprises and states start investing in sustainable activities. So jobs is perhaps not so much the problem. The problem is that that enterprise, if it can't do a better job, may have to go bankrupt. Yeah, well, terribly sorry, so be it. otherwise the price is way too high. If that would be what most enterprises could argue, there's no solution. A state would argue the same. Well, yeah, well, but you realize, of course, we are really very keen to reduce our emissions to a very high extent, but not now. You realize there are many reasons, the COVID-19 crisis, and we financial crisis, or God knows what. Well, that kind of justifications should simply not work. As to lobbying, well, I couldn't agree more. Lobbying for what is less than what needs to be done should simply not be allowed. And that is, in different wording, what we are saying. I like the idea that the corporate world should be active to cooperate in designing adequate obligations. Thank you for the idea. It's highly interesting. Whether there is a legal obligation to do that, I'm not sure, but the idea is no less valuable. Thank you very much.
Joachim, would you like to respond?
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, thank you. I mean, the jobs question, it turns out always to be a political one as well. I mean, coming from Germany, and we have to reshape like the car industry, the automobile industry, for example, which is like the major industry here, and so many jobs are attached to it. Of course, the jobs issue becomes a political one also. And the question I always keep having is, I mean, if you shut down very quickly much of the car industry, really many people will lose their jobs, and you might lose the political support for climate policy. So it's not only that people lose their jobs, but it also becomes a political question of maintaining political momentum for climate ambition or climate protection. And that's, I think, a difficult one to make companies responsible. Even though I agree that also the German car industry slept for too long and didn't invest enough in electric vehicles, for example, but still it's difficult for them to navigate around those different obligations, I think.
Well, Germany could decide to put an obligation on the shoulders of other enterprises to reduce their emissions at a higher, to a higher extent. It could close coal-fired power plants, to mention another alternative, and also in light of our principles, if they would do that, and if doing so, Germany would comply with its own obligations, it could relieve the car manufacturer from part of its reduction obligation. But if we would allow states or enterprises to say, well, not me, without putting an additional burden on someone else, well, we know what's going to happen, catastrophe. Not in my lifetime, hopefully. I'm 70 now, so it's probably more your problem than mine. But be assured, you will get a problem. So we really must find answers, and we should stop thinking along the lines, well, this comes at the price. Yes, everything comes as a price, but the price of global catastrophe is simply too high. That must be avoided. But of course, there are, as I mentioned, alternative possibilities. We face a similar problem currently in the Netherlands. As you probably know, the Dutch Supreme Court has upheld the judgment of the Court of First Instance that the Dutch state has to reduce its emissions by 25% by the end of this year. And, well, as was to be expected, the government is arguing, we are very keen to do that, as you may appreciate. But now it's a little bit difficult. But we may do it next year, or perhaps the year thereafter. But of course we will do it, but not now. Yeah. If we would think along those lines, the solution is a hopeless case. But of course, I appreciate your question, and of course, I realize the problem. It may be a bit different in poor countries, and we don't say much about it, but we realize that there may be a conflict of human rights obligations, climate change versus jobs, and that the answer in really poor countries might be very different. But Germany is certainly not a very poor country. But I'm afraid I didn't fully convince you.
Oh, sorry, I wrote it in the chat. No, thank you. I agree with you totally. I was just wondering in how far really companies should have that obligation, or rather governments.
Well, the problem with governments is that it is much more difficult to sue them, at least to gain victory, as recent cases have shown. Well, the Dutch agenda case was a brilliant victory, but the state won't comply with the judgment, but still. And that's the end of the rule of law in my country. But there are not so many. Well, there's a recent judgment in Ireland that is hopeful, but there are not so very many against states that are really hopeful. If you sue enterprises, the political issue is less of a problem. It's still a problem, but less of a problem. And on top of that, you can only sue states before their own courts if you ignore international courts. And you can sue international companies before courts in many countries. So that's much easier.
Okay, we have another question by Bruna. Bruna, would you like to try to open up your mic and express it with your own voice? Okay, so Bruna wrote as a question, if enterprises must follow the rules of the places it's operating, can that be some guidelines about cultural productive expectations?
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
Okay, I'll repeat. He wrote, I'm sorry, I don't know. If enterprises must follow the rules of the places that it is operating in, can that be some guidelines for cultural productive expectations?
It's a fair question. We are slightly overstating our case, saying that there is one universal solution that goes for all countries, all enterprises around the world. We also have used words such as excessive and similar features that leave a lot of room for interpretation based on the specificities of a specific country. But at the end of the day, what needs to be done is that we keep global warming below fatal thresholds. And unless politicians come up with a clear, pertinent, workable and sufficient legal instrument, and I'm not going to, and don't expect that soon, then you can't avoid working with broader formula that may or may not be interpreted or adapted by domestic courts, fair enough. But we need a kind of a broad network with at least this is by and large what it should be. And that is already quite something. And a group like ours can't do more than that. And I can assure you, it was already quite a job. But the question is fair.
Thank you. Thank you. I've just received a message that the participants cannot open up their mics. So I thought maybe since some of the speakers can, maybe the participants as well, but apparently not. So I'm sorry about that. Matt has another question. So if we can do it within a framework of 2 minutes, please, then we have to go to the next speaker. Please go ahead, Matt.
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation and for your explanation. Jaap. The question that I have, obviously, I think you know that our organization disagrees on what the appropriate climate targets should be around parts per million of carbon dioxide and also degrees of warming. But setting that aside for a second, I thought something you said about industry was really interesting. As you know, there are like several pieces of litigation happening against industry on behalf of states in the United States. If you think that that is the correct avenue for litigation because of the avoiding the questions of political doctrine, who pays for that litigation? As you know that industry has access to some of the best law firms in the world and some of the most, and they're willing to pay top dollar for in these sort of bet the company litigations where they are being sued for the damages, which are sometimes in the billions and trillions of dollars. And it is my thinking that it would be challenging for organizations like ours or frankly, most nonprofits to bring litigation against oil companies and gas companies because of the cost that it would immediately ensue on our organizations. And I wonder if you have any thinking or thoughts around the solution for how to successfully pay for the expensive litigation against corporations.
First, your first point. I don't think we really disagree. What you and Julia were saying is that by or after 2100, we should go back to 1 degree or less. My learned friends and I are not talking about 2100 and thereafter. We are talking about the 1 or 2 decades to come. I personally, I fully agree with the desirability of going back to 1 degree as soon as possible. I very much agree with the idea that 1.5 and 1.75 is too high. Of course, look at what already happens these days, the many natural catastrophes around the globe. Of course, I agree. But we should first reach the stage that we have 0 net emissions, and by then we can start thinking about and what next. So I think that we have much more in common than you believe. And then your question, no, I don't have an answer. All I know, but you also know that yourself, is that there are many very wealthy associations very much willing to sponsor litigation, and you know that probably much better than I do. Well, our project is run on less than a shoestring. We don't have any money at all. So if you're talking about fundraising, don't ask me. But yes, it is a problem. Ideally speaking, it should be a solution, but I don't have it. Sorry. And I hope that I have convinced you that we do not really disagree.
Okay, with your permission. Yeah, Matt, please.
No, I think you need to end this, like move on to the next speakers right now.
Yes, unfortunately,
Okay.
so maybe we have time at the end. Let's just put things in context and say that the current atmospheric CO2 is 415 particles per million, unfortunately, and we have surpassed the level of 350 at 1987, more than 30 years ago. So we are not in a good situation right now, and that's just to put things in context. Jaap, thank you so much for your educative presentation and for broad thinking about this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now, thank you. Let's move on to our next two speakers. And we are welcoming Anna. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Please say it your way. Skowron and Joachim Fünfgelt from the World Future Council. Please, the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot. So I'm from the World Future Council. Joachim is actually from Brot für die Welt, Bread for the World. But I also count him as a colleague already, so that's fine. Joachim is sharing our presentation. So first of all, thanks everybody for joining and good afternoon. And thanks Thomas for the very kind invitation as well. I think it was very well said before. We are in a very dire situation, right? We have passed the limits of our Earth, and if we want to have a future, we really need to do something. And climate litigation is really a key aspect of doing so and holding not just governments but also industry and everybody really accountable to do something and phase out of fossil fuels. But of course, there's also the other side. So we still need the energy, we still need to have production, we still need to come from point A to point B, etc. And that's what we have been doing in the last years. We have been working on science-based trajectories for a 100% renewable energy future. We have done so mostly in the global south, and more specifically in Bangladesh, Tanzania, Costa Rica, and also starting a project in Nepal, Vietnam, and Uganda. And what we are doing exactly, we will come to later. But in a nutshell, we are working with scenarios modeled by the University of Technology in Sydney, who are working on building 100% renewable energy scenarios by really inputting in validated data from the ground with people involved from all across the sectors. So we are talking about utilities, industry, civil society, and government as well. And we are using these kind of scenarios then and the findings and results to highlight which barriers exist, how can we overcome them, what kind of policies do we need to do so. And that's what we are going to talk about in roughly the next 30 minutes. So Joachim, if you could click, thanks, to the next slide. So I think we established now we are not on track to limit global warming to 2.3 degrees or 1.5 or anything near there. And that is even though 77 countries, 10 regions, and more than 100 cities have already committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. There are countless of industries already committed to 100% renewable energy and also energy efficiency improvements. In addition, more institutions than ever have committed to divest either fully or substantially from fossil fuels, including the European Investment Bank, the Norway Sovereign Fund, and the US Investment Bank Goldman Sachs as well. And to do so, we need the next slide. Thanks. And still we are not on track. What we can see here, and kudos to REN21 for the excellent work on the Renewables Global Status Report, we see that renewable power is growing all over the world. By the end of 2019, 47 countries across 6 continents had at least 1 gigawatt of solar and wind power in operation, compared to just 18 countries in 2009. And between 2013 and 2018, renewables have grown faster than any other energy source. But, and we need the next slide. Thanks. But despite this, the share of renewables in total final energy consumption has seen only a moderate increase. In fact, Modern renewables account for only about 11% of total final energy consumption in 2018. And the largest share of which is being actually in the power sector. And we need the next slide. Yes. And in the power sector, renewables account for about a third of global electricity production, and they have seen an increase in net additions in power generation capacities of 75% in 2019, compared to just 25% of additions of non-renewable sources. So that is quite remarkable. But yet, the penetration of renewables in the final end users of thermal and transport sector energy is extremely low. On the one hand, mostly due to a lack of supporting policies in these sectors, but also because in a couple of countries, there are actually no real targets for renewable heat or renewable energy support in industry has remained scarce in 2019. Any kind of targets for transport are also only slowly coming up. And of course, we have an increase in fossil fuel subsidies, and need the next slide. In 2018, fossil fuel subsidies, oh no, sorry, we need one more slide, sorry. Thanks. In 2018, fossil fuel subsidies accounted for about $400 billion US. And that is really a major share which is going into obsolete fossil fuel technologies and really is challenging the increase of renewables. And just to put it a bit in comparison, in perspective, $400 billion US is about more than double of the estimate for support of the renewable power generation sector within the same year. And also low prices for fossil fuels further encourage demand and challenge the role of renewable energy markets. And that is actually despite all the large negative externalities, such as air pollution, traffic congestion, climate change, etc., which cost society around $5.2 trillion US. So that is a large sum, and with that you could do, you could start ending poverty. You could really try to get local economies off the ground, but we are not yet doing so. However, I think we should see the COVID-19 pandemic we are currently facing with all its challenges. We also have the opportunity to change the setting. And we need the next slide. Thanks. It's basically a tale of two stories. On the one side, we have a very well-working renewable energy sector and a declining fossil fuel sector. Global renewable electricity installations really hit a record level this year, and solar became the cheapest available source of energy, a fact which even the International Energy Agency recently acknowledged, and they have been more conservative in their estimates in the past years. And indeed, even the IEA estimates that about 90% of new electricity generation this year will come from renewables. So just 10% of new installations will probably come from non-renewable sources. And if this trend continues, renewables might be well on track to become the largest power source by 2025, actually displacing coal, which dominated the power sector for the past 5 decades. So that is a huge transformation which is lying right ahead of us. And we also have seen time and time again in the past months that renewable energy is defying the impact of the pandemic, which is currently wreaking havoc on the fossil fuel industry. They are showing an extraordinary growth, while other non-renewable sources struggle really to continue to exist. So the share of supply met by renewables reached a record high in China, Europe, India, and also the US in this year. In China, wind and solar power generation increased by 1% and 12%. And in the EU and the UK, coal-based power generation fell by a third, while renewables continue still to deliver almost half of all power generation, which is up around 8% compared to last year during the same time. The picture is considerably darker on the other side though. So every month of full lockdown reduced electricity demand by about 20% on average, at least according to estimations. And with a decline in demand, the demand for coal and oil reduced as well by around 8 to 5% respectively, leading to tumbling oil prices, which fell to below zero in April for the first time ever. And they are still well below profitability levels of 2019 now. And as a result, even oil giants like Shell and BP had to significantly adjust their profit margins this year, which fell way beyond, well behind the profits of last year as well. And in fact, even to BP's own global energy forecasts, they suggest that oil demand may never recover post-COVID. And that underlines and highlights the plans of BP to reduce oil and gas production and instead scale up investment into renewables, which is quite remarkable for such a company, I would say. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So we see that renewables faring quite well currently in the pandemic. And sorry. And we have the chance to scale them up through the quite large stimulus packages which are currently stipulated around the world currently. Those stimulus packages currently are likely to be a lot larger than the ones during or after the financial crisis, and we should really put them to good use. And just to quote what the IEA has said, renewables are resilient to the COVID crisis, but not to policy uncertainties. And therefore, we should really put some efforts into a green transition and to enabling a level playing field for renewables. And there are also good reasons to do so. We already talked a bit about the jobs and a just and fair transition, which is depending on those as well. So just to name a couple of the benefits, renewables can reduce indoor and outdoor air pollution and thus decrease the risk of respiratory diseases and thus unburden the health system, which is currently on the brink of collapsing in many countries. The renewable energy sector employed about 11.5 million people last year alone, with women holding about 1/3 of these jobs. This is in comparison more than the fossil fuel industry. And in fact, renewables can generate more jobs than any other industry. And I'm taking some examples from our work here. A fully renewable energy-based system in Bangladesh has the potential to create about around 1.1 million jobs by 2050, as compared to only 0.1 million jobs under a business as usual scenario, which is currently envisioned by the policies in Bangladesh. And we have found similar things in Tanzania and Costa Rica as well. And also industrial development in many parts of the world, such as Tanzania as well, industry is increasingly relying on on-site renewable installations to avoid blackouts in production. And in addition, renewables can boost local economic development and facilitate productive uses in sectors such as agriculture as well. And lastly, obviously, if you're installing renewables, which are everywhere, you can decrease your energy imports. And this leads to quite substantial fossil fuel cost savings. In some cases, these savings can actually finance most of the additional investment needed to make 100% renewable energy a reality. And if we go to the next slide, what we would need to do so, we would really need to scale up renewable energy deployment through our stimulus packages. So increase procurement levels, increase funding through tax incentives and fiscal stimulus packages. Incentivize emerging technologies such as storage, which is a big issue and pops up in all the discussions. Or also electric vehicles and green hydrogen, which is currently hotly discussed, I think, pretty much everywhere. We need to de-risk renewable energy policies. In some countries, this is less of an issue than in others, but all in all, we do need to de-risk renewable energy policies and technologies and really try to get the awareness going here. We also need to leverage central banks, which can use green bonds and guarantees and cannot be bankrupt in their own currency. And also we need to increase renewable energy targets to actually hold the governments, the industry, etc., accountable. So that fits quite well what has been said before. And we need to avoid stop and go cycles. So we need to couple these stimulus packages with renewable energy, climate targets, and the right supporting policies. And if we can go to the next slide, then I'm almost done, and I'm probably a bit too fast. Currently, renewables are discussed being in current stimulus packages. I think that is fair to say. And what we can see is a considerable scale up of especially climate action in currently stipulated stimulus packages. Often it's actually being made a strategic pillar of recovery. And to date, we see large parts of the longer term recovery efforts are being invested directly into energy and energy efficiency, or indirectly via measures in the transport or industry sector. The most discussed measures relate to one or several of the following topics, which I have been written here: energy efficiency in buildings, e-mobility, CCUS, so carbon capture and storage, and hydrogen production. However, we also see quite some significant ambivalence in the recovery messages and budgets actually stipulated. So what we see on this slide here is that G20 countries committed at least $420 billion to some kind of energy. However, as you can see here, that almost half of this is committed towards fossil fuels and have no green conditions attached to it at all. So they are just being put in the fossil fuel industry. In comparison, only around $15 billion can be classified as unconditional and clean energy. And further 96 billion could be potentially green, but depends on several conditions. For instance, that e-mobility or e-vehicles should be powered by electricity sources from renewables rather than fossil fuel electricity, or that environmental and social safeguards are being stipulated to ensure green hydrogen export and import does not leave local populations in energy poverty or even forces resettlements. And my last slide, then I will be giving to Joachim. Thank you. Just some highlights of the current recovery packages stipulated. So on the one side, we have RE scale up. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Spanish president, Pedro Sánchez, announced a rapid scale up of RE towards a fully renewable energy-based system by 2050. And we see that onshore and offshore wind, as well as solar, play a huge role here, especially distributed energy and local climate action, but also on a larger scale. We also see investments that have been proven already efficient during the last financial crisis. So hopefully lesson learned, and this will work again. We also see that community energy projects, for instance, in Germany, currently see a significant increase in demand by communities since the crisis hit, due to more local supply chains, etc. We have energy efficiency in buildings, which also has proven quite positive on stimulating or re-stimulating the economic and service sector after the financial crisis. We have e-mobility, which plays a role in pretty much all recovery packages today. And measures include increased charging infrastructure, fleet penetration, but also financial incentives for private and public transport. However, and that's one of my last points, measures are often not detailed enough to determine if e-mobility will at this point be powered by fossil fuel-based electricity or renewable electricity. Having targets and commitments here could really help. And in addition, sometimes there are actually arbitrary measures. So Germany, for instance, is subsidizing purchase of hybrid cars, even if they can be powered 100% by fossil fuels, which doesn't make any sense at all. So there should be something holding governments and industry accountable, as we have said before. And lastly, hydrogen. Hydrogen, I think, is the hot topic of the year and of the current crisis. However, there's often a strategy lacking. So we don't have any clear environmental and social safeguards, as I said before. And of it also is not yet mature enough. So we will really need to see if any investments into hydrogen actually play out as intended. In addition, the CO2 footprint from transportation of hydrogen will need to be assessed as well. And those are the highlights, and with that I would give over to Joachim.
To find my audio here. Okay, thank you very much, Anna, for setting the scene with the global trends in energy and the possibilities renewable energy might have and their role in recovery packages and their potential. I would like to take over and guide you all through the work that we have been doing together, Bread for the World and World Future Council. Maybe just 2 sentences on Bread for the World. Brot für die Welt. We are a German development organization working in roughly 100 countries all over the world with local partner organizations. So we do not implement ourselves, but we support local civil society organizations with their projects on all kinds of issues regarding poverty eradication, and energy being one of those topics. And in that work, now jointly with World Future Council, we worked on 100% renewable energy strategies in Global South countries. And even though those countries like Tanzania are not the ones most responsible for climate change, actually one could say they're not responsible at all. But still, I think we can learn a lot, even for the transitions here in industrialized countries. And I would like to guide you through what we did and what we learned from there. And before I do that, I will give you a bit of an insight how the energy sector in those countries looks like, and what sort of potential we saw there to start our work. And I will start with giving you an insight on Tanzania and then on Bangladesh, because they are 2 totally different countries, also like culturally, obviously, geographically, but also in terms of their energy sector. And they sort of exemplify what we can learn in those, in several Global South countries. So I start with Tanzania. If the presentation moves on here. So the biggest issue in Tanzania is the one of energy access, or otherwise put, energy poverty. On the left, you see the graph, the percentage of the population with access to electricity. And it's like in the early 2000s, it was officially at roughly 10% and has grown now to something like close to 40% now. These are official numbers. If you talk with some local actors, these numbers are even a lot lower. And you have to see also that access to electricity doesn't necessarily mean that you can plug your computer in and have electricity all day. It just means you are theoretically, or you are practically linked to the grid. But if you to get electricity might be a different thing. So some of these people of these 40% might have electricity for 1 hour a day and not more. And of course, this is a great barrier to development. And the right graph is even more worrying. The access to sustainable cooking, which is still far below 10%, meaning that all the rest of the population is still cooking with open fire, be it with cow dung or charcoal or wood, which is then responsible, of course, for a lot of health issues. In sub-Saharan Africa, more people die of respiratory diseases coming from indoor cooking. More people die of that than of AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis combined. So it's really, really a problem for health, especially of women, and also a problem regarding deforestation, because people have to go around and collect firewood, which contributes heavily to deforestation. And on the map down there of Tanzania, you see that especially in rural areas, electrification is very, very low. So in many rural areas, it's far below 10% even the electrification status, and only like in the capital, in the major city, Dar es Salaam, it's at about 60%, and in the rural areas, very, very low. So energy access and energy poverty is a main issue. And to see energy consumption then in the country, total energy consumption, it's the left graph, is Tanzania. Most of the energy consumed is really in households, the residential sector, transport, industry, commercial, public services, very, very low. So most of this is residential use, mainly cooking. If you compare that to the energy consumption of the USA, there you have, of course, a different picture where transport is most of it, but you can see also the numbers. So transport has 600,000 kilotons of oil equivalents in the US. So you see that the scales there, whereas in Tanzania, residential has 12,000. So it's a totally different scale, and you can see how energy poor in a way, or how little access people have to energy there. So energy supply per capita, same, less than 0.4 tons of oil equivalents there. In the US, you have between 7 and 8. So a lot more, and you can see the difference, the inequality there. How is electricity supplied in Tanzania? Electricity, oil plays a part with diesel generators, hydro, and fossil gas. Solar PV is just slowly growing. You can see it in between hydro and natural gas. You see a little bit growing there. But so you see most of it is yet non-renewable, with natural gas especially growing heavily. But we shouldn't forget that electricity is only a minor part of energy consumption in many global South countries. So this is numbers from 2009, but they haven't changed drastically. Like roughly 90% are just biofuels and waste for cooking, and electricity really plays a minor role. So really working on energy access regarding cooking and replacing that is important, but it also means that there is a huge potential for really leapfrogging the fossil age, to build up new energy systems from scratch. There are basically almost no grids. There is hardly any electricity used. You can really imagine, like, you take an empty paper and draw from scratch an energy system, and that allows you, of course, to leapfrog easily the fossil age. And it also allows you to think of energy and development co-benefits heavily. So how is an energy system supposed to be designed to achieve a maximum of development? So that's sort of the situation we found in Tanzania. And now the same graphs basically for Bangladesh, and you will see the differences. First, proportion of population with access to electricity in Bangladesh. So there's not much of a difference, other than it's heavily increasing in Bangladesh. No, there is, sorry for that. 80% Bangladesh have access to electricity, which was increasing in the last years, mainly due to, starting from 2010, solar home system programs that worked out really, really well. Funded by international development banks who supported that with different schemes of rent-to-own systems, so that users could sort of rent and pay off their solar home systems over the years until they own it. These have worked very well to create higher shares of access to electricity in the country. We hope that Tanzania can benefit from that experience. So Bangladesh has a higher share of population with access to electricity. However, energy supply per capita is also very low. It's even per capita lower than in Tanzania. People oftentimes, when they have solar home systems, have a very low level of energy supply. They often have like 30 watt, 80 watt, 100 watt solar panels on their roof, enough for some lighting and maybe a radio, which means then they have in general access to electricity, but not high numbers. And Bangladesh is a very high and densely populated country with about 160 million people. So that, yes, there is access to electricity, but in very low numbers. And so, but how does the total final consumption by sector look like in Bangladesh? And that's one of the major differences. Also, residential energy use is highest, but you see on the left graph a high share of, a growing share of industry consuming energy, and also transport, which on the right, to compare again with Tanzania, you don't see there. So you have in Bangladesh a situation where still there is energy poverty, but at the same time, a hugely growing demand from industry and also the transport sector. And so far, Bangladesh is mostly importing the energy for that, which I show on the next slide. Most of it is is fossil gas, which is imported, but also more and more oil is being imported, and down there also coal is increasing, which is also imported from India mainly. So you saw a large amount of increase of fossil fuel use, while we see a huge potential there for renewable energy to cover that increase in energy demand in the country, because also the country starts noticing the downsides of that fossil fuel boom in the country. And one disadvantage are of course health issues from pollution, because those coal plants that they have are obviously not clean ones, if that exists, but they are very dirty ones, leading to a lot of pollution, and also it creates dependencies on neighboring countries from which they import those fossil fuels. So there are some political drivers going towards renewables, which we wanted to support, and we wanted to see how that might work in a country that is already depending on fossil fuels, but still has an enormous increase in demand, which is also a different situation from ones we see, for example, in Europe, where demand on energy is supposed to decrease rather due to efficiency measures, whereas in most global south countries, this won't be the case. So we have, so there are two completely different countries, I guess, Bangladesh and Tanzania. And now, after you got that background, I would like to show you in a way what we did in those countries. And what we did, our approach was, first, we tried to build what you see here in the center, some multi-actor partnership. And the idea was to bring together sort of the visionary, progressive people in a country, be it from all sector, be it from civil society, from business, from government, parliament, academia, obviously, media. So sort of visionary, progressive people who think about the energy system together, and first, on the bottom left in phase one, develop a joint vision. And we noticed quickly, or we knew from our work in development, that the narrative for the energy transition that we use, for example, in Germany or in Europe, or also in other industrialized countries, the narrative of climate change, and which is sort of a negative one, because it sort of states, well, we have a well-working energy system, but we need to change it because of climate change. That doesn't work in global south countries, because you quickly get the argument, hey, we didn't contribute much. The north already used its climate budget, so we should get part of the cake and also emit something before we think about decarbonization. So in order to develop, we should build and use fossil fuels. So we engaged in that differently by developing a vision, firstly, about how is the energy sector supposed to look like? What kind of benefits do you want to have? So we try to confront that in a sort of positive way. So what are the pull factors, if you like? Be it full energy access for everyone, be it energy independence, not needing imports, maybe even exporting. Building up an industry, a renewable energy industry, creating more jobs for women especially, less health impact, more resilience towards economic crises, but also the climate crisis. So these were sort of the factors we were looking for, and to create like a positive vision of how an energy system is supposed to look like, even before looking at which kind of fuels to use. So which would be the factors for a positive development energy system? We then sort of worked together with people on the ground on collecting data and information. Data about the energy used, and behavior, like how do households in a country use energy over the day, what kind of equipment is there. And you can imagine in a country like Tanzania where little fraction of the population has access to energy, it's a hard question of how would they use energy if they had access. But we sort of kind of went into that, also discussed that, collected data on imports, exports, prices, household incomes, and so on. And then developed with the University of Technology in Sydney 100% renewable scenarios, or let's say energy scenarios in general. And I might say a few words on how these scenarios work. They on the first hand collected or created information about what the energy resources in a country really are. So what are the solar resources and where exactly are they? They use geographical models or geographical data from a country to really very exactly, like in square kilometers, calculate, okay, how much sunshine is there and how much solar radiation arrives there, how much wind is there potential for geothermal, for bioenergy. Of course, also they considered the fossil resources of the country and really mapped that very thoroughly to get an idea of what the resources in a country really are. So that would be for the supply side, and for the demand side, really create models towards 2050 of how the country is developing, also what the vision of the stakeholders of the government is, how to develop it. For Tanzania, for example, the government wanted to become a middle income country by 2025. So you need a lot of a lot of economic growth there. Like which kind of industries are supposed to settle down where exactly in the country. So all that kind of information, population growth, data and all that to factor in how's the development of demand over time. Also, if the country becomes, or if less people really live in poverty, what will be their energy demand? If people move more towards the cities, how will demand change? How will mobility behavior change? All that was factored in on the demand side. And then in a third step, the researchers developed scenarios on how in the future this demand can be met, and how to build up like an optimal energy system. And they modeled energy systems completely with renewables, and also as a baseline sort of for comparison, a business as usual scenario with the targets the government had thus far. So also with growing shares of coal and fossil gas, for example. So that we could compare which of those systems designed has more advantages, referring to the vision that actors have developed before. So we could, in Tanzania, for example, show, hey, you can overcome or eradicate energy poverty much quicker with renewables, because they can be installed much quicker. They can be installed, especially in rural areas, much quicker. You don't need all that infrastructure. You don't need to build grids at the first place and so on, but you can sort of have a bottom-up electrification approach where you put a lot of decentralized units all over the country, and after a while start connecting them and build a grid, so to speak, bottom up, which you cannot do when you build like big fossil fuel utilities from which you need to sort of get the energy to the people. So that was one of the biggest advantages there. For example, you could see which one is cheaper, energy independence quicker, and so on. And we were quite happy to see that in all those aspects, renewable energy approach won in those scenarios. We used the scenarios then in the next step for capacity building and narrative building with the actors. Capacity building important so that all actors really understand what's in those scenarios. For government representatives, for example, it was important to understand how the whole analysis of resource potential works. So they kind of understood, hey, there is more wind potential than we thought. Or in the case of Bangladesh, It was new for them that the country really has a really high offshore wind potential, or that it's possible also to build floating solar in Bangladesh, which can be used because, like, due to the climate crisis now, a third of the country regularly is flooded. And so this land cannot really be used, but you can put floating solar there. So put the solar panels on basically a swimming construction, which can stand on the ground when the land is not flooded and swim as soon as it's flooded. So that gives this sort of land a new productive use again, and you can use solar there. So these kind of ideas, to share them with stakeholders and to really make them understand what all those numbers mean, was important. And in the next step, we kind of co-created or collaborated on policy roadmaps and look at what politically needs to change in the country, which reforms are needed. And we also discussed that with international donors like Germany, to give them an idea of how they might change their support. And then a last step, of course, we used all that information for advocacy, and last step, policy reform. And of course, it's always difficult to measure the impact of that. I can just say Tanzania is currently revising its NDC, and it's referring to the scenario in that and giving a much higher importance to renewable energy than ever before. And of course, this is a process, and of course, we need to think beyond such a project logic. But that was like one of the successes there. And in Bangladesh, I was like really, really happy to hear this year that the government canceled 26 out of 29 planned new coal-fired power plants. So the government was planning to build 29 new ones, and they canceled 26. Of course, why they did that has a lot of reasons, but we kind of claim like a little impact on that as well. That was more or less like the phase of the work that we did in those countries so far. And now I come to some more general lessons learned we drew from that. So on the technical side, like first thing, when we started, and one of the ideas in Tanzania, and one of the reasons we really collaborated with the universities on scenarios, was that people kept asking us, is 100% RE feasible? Is it like, they knew, okay, we can with solar home systems power a home, but is it possible to power industry? And I mean, in Germany, we get this argument all the time. Is it really feasible? So one of the things we learned from those scenarios, to really on an hourly basis calculated how a renewable supply can match demand. Yes, it was feasible in all cases, and in all cases, it was even cheaper than any fossil fuel scenario, which we used as business as usual comparison. And the reason mainly was that the fuel cost savings may refinance the initial investments. Of course, renewable energy requires more investment upfront, but then they are basically zero marginal cost technologies. So while running them, you don't have to pay anything. So even if you go in rural Tanzania and you have a village, and they have to decide, do we buy a diesel generator or like a solar system with a mini grid? Of course, the solar one will be more expensive upfront. Diesel generators are not expensive, but a diesel generator requires diesel, which you have to get to the village all the time. So it's not diesel prices we are used to, but much higher ones. So over time, this diesel generator gets much more costly than basically zero marginal cost system. So that's why over time, 100% RE pathway, because what I explained now with the village is also true for countries in a way. So this over time, this RE system is cheaper. So the point really is to make financing that possible. It's best suited to provide access for all. I already mentioned that you just don't need to build a grid that goes everywhere. And it's also much quicker, like a wind park, even a utility scale, a big wind park usually takes like 6 months to build. A solar utility scale plant, maybe 1 month. Like a a nuclear facility in average 12 years, and even a coal plant 7 to 8 years. So from planning to really delivering energy, and then you do not yet have built a grid. And even big hydro dams like those mega dams in China, or some of which are now built in Africa as well, they also take at least 10 years from planning to really delivering electricity. So decentralized smaller systems which enable bottom-up electrification can be built much quicker, and therefore also eradicate energy poverty much quicker. Yet in all of the scenarios, significant improvements in energy efficiency were really crucial. Cooking is of course one example which needs to be done much more efficient, but in all appliances efficiency was always key, and also in the global south we need to invest in that a lot more, so that at the end local resources such as wood can be saved. Another point that we learned, the storage requirements, which are always an argument of fossil lobbyists as well, saying we don't have the storage technology for renewable energy systems countrywide. Well, we were surprised. In Tanzania, for example, the demand for storage was below 16% of the whole capacity, and you do not own, and you only have to build storage significantly after 2035, 2030. So you have a long range of building up a system with renewables, and only after having reached a really high share of renewables in the system, you need to think about storage. So many global south countries can wait with that until industrialized countries did the innovation part and storage becomes cheaper. And it's not that much a problem as often discussed. And of course, limiting the global warming to 1.5 requires 100% RE. It's basically the only way to enable global south countries to develop without contributing more to the climate crisis. Two more slides.
Joachim,
one on.
Can you hear me? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I sincerely apologize. We have to be watchful of the time, and there are 10 minutes left for Q&A. So
okay, thank you. I only have 2 more.
Okay, go ahead. Yes.
I will. Okay. In terms of more social lessons learned, only 2 more slides, so it's quick. The point we noticed there, it's of course a process, and civil society plays a crucial role in that. So strengthening civil society is important as basically a bridge builder between society, government, academia. I think we as civil society have a crucial role there. And also to, as I said, develop more of a positive mindset, saying that this energy transition doesn't need to be driven by obligations towards climate change. It can also be driven by sort of a positive vision of which positive changes we want to achieve. As I said, be it eradicating energy poverty, be it energy democracy, be it cheaper electricity, or whatever you may find, or what is important for countries. It's important to work with the right stakeholders on that from all sectors, progressive people who work towards this joint vision. And of those points, I think important is also to keep that long-term view of the process, and knowing that there will be ups and downs, and it's really a long-term transformation process where we all learn and keep learning. So we need to think in time frames really of 10, 20 years there, and not really work with hit and run campaigns where you do something for a year and then leave and do something else. So really keep that long time horizon, which also needs to be discussed, of course, with funders. And now to my last slides. Last slide here, make the process relevant on the policy level is of course key, and that means you need to link that energy transition issue to those issues that are most relevant in a country at the moment. And we said it like in Tanzania, energy poverty, in Bangladesh, health, energy imports, energy demand, so quickly having more capacity. So knowing these drivers and using them is important. Of course, strengthening policy coherence, and also having an eye on socioeconomic aspects in general. And of those points, maybe just again, the policy science interface here is really important. Science-based, to set science-based targets, make research accessible and relevant. And we would really like to see also and work on that, that not a university in Sydney needs to do those scenarios for a country, but the University of Dar es Salaam can do that for Tanzania and can do that continuously. So this kind of scientific discourse and exchange needs to be strengthened as well. So I quit with that, look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, and thank you again for having us. It's really a pleasure to speak in such a forum now and get outside the bubble in which we usually speak. So I really enjoy this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation and the work that you do in the world. Let's see if some of the participants want to share thoughts, comments, questions. Then Thomas wants to say something.
Yeah, I just have a small question about geothermal energy and what role it plays, heating and cooling with geothermal. Is that a major component of a best strategy, or can you say anything about that component?
Well, when you mean geothermal, do you mean in a similar way as we might use, as we can use it here in Europe as well, that you use electricity for heat pumps, or is it geothermal rather for electricity production?
No, not for electricity production. For heating and cooling, it's supposed to be really super efficient, right? That you have, for example, especially if you have a whole district heating and you have pipes in the ground that bring up whatever the constant temperature in the ground is, 54 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, and then use that for either heating or cooling.
Well, in those countries, it's more an issue for cooling. And yes, it is. I would have to look up the numbers. I'm not totally sure what the numbers were, but it was a part for cooling where you use basically solar electricity to use basically heat pumps for cooling. Yes, but I would have to look up at the numbers on which scale that really was. I don't have that in mind.
I mean, one nice feature of it is efficiency. Another nice feature is you have no intermittency problem, because you can tap that resource 24/7. Doesn't matter whether the sun shines or the wind blows or whatever. So you need no batteries.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I know that in Tanzania it played a bigger role because there you had more potential because you didn't have to dig that as deep. And I remember in Bangladesh the potential wasn't as big. But for definite numbers, I would have to look that up again.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just to add, the geothermal also usually plays quite a role in industrial heating processes. And at least in Costa Rica, it has its downsides as well, because most of the geothermal potential is located in protected areas. So obviously, we do not want to go into protected areas to dig up geothermal energy. So there are some issues with it as well. But generally speaking, it can definitely help to gather bioenergy to really decarbonize the industry sector as well.
Thank you.
Let's see if someone in the audience wants to share a thought or question. If we won't have time to respond or to address what you suggest, then the speakers will receive your comments and questions and will respond later. So please feel welcome to write. Unfortunately, you cannot use your mics, I guess, for security reasons. But please feel welcome to write any comment or question that you want. Okay, so let's conclude We had a fascinating 3-hour session. Thomas, any final thoughts that you want to share?
Not really, just basically to thank everybody. I thought it was a terrific session, and so far we had 2 wonderful, wonderful days. So it's always a lot of work to organize these conferences, but then being able to see them come together is just a wonderful reward. So this will all be posted on a YouTube channel, I think, and then it will be there for posterity to enjoy, and we will make sure that additional people have a chance to watch it. Also people who are in different time zones, you know, people in China, for example, India and so on, for whom it's very difficult to be with us at this time of day.
We are already at YouTube. People can watch us through YouTube.
Thank you, Clarice. Any final thoughts from the speakers?